From an afterthought to a potentially more pressing need, the Phillies find themselves unsure of who will fill the final bench spot to start the year. Let's talk about it next on the PHLY Phillies podcast. Weston Wilson suffered what is being called a freak accident injury when he suffered a grade 2 oblique strain this weekend while taking batting practice at the Phillies spring training facilities. The Phillies said that Wilson will miss at least 6 weeks, which means that his return at best would be around the second week of April. I'd also imagine that at some point he's going to need a ramp-up period, so you're potentially looking at a closer return to the middle of April before Wilson would return to the 26-man roster. With that timeline in mind, it's likely that Wilson will miss at least the first few weeks of the regular season. This is significant because it felt like Wilson was probably going to secure the final bench spot for the Phillies opening day roster when the team heads to Washington to take on the Nationals at the end of March. It did feel like this for a couple of reasons. The biggest one, Weston Wilson's right-handed in a lefty-heavy roster. The Phillies will feature at least 4 lefties in their everyday lineup, and when Max Kepler plays, it would be a 5th. On days where JT Realmuto doesn't catch and Rafael Marchand does, with a righty on the mound, it could be as many as 6 lefties in the lineup, with Marchand being a switch hitter. The point is, the Phillies needed right-handed pop off the bench. Wilson would have been that guy to provide just that. In just shy of 100 plate appearances last year, Wilson hit .284, had a .489 slugging percentage, and drove in 10 runs. Obviously, he doesn't qualify for leaderboards, but he did post a 15% barrel rate and a 50% hard hit rate in limited action last season. He hit .341 against lefties with an above 1 OPS. Also, he mashes fastballs. He hit .382 against fastballs in 2024. Wilson also provides the Phillies with positional versatility if needed. Now, I wouldn't recommend playing Weston Wilson at third, but he could play there as well as up to 4 other different positions like he did last year, including all 3 outfield spots. So while it's not detrimental to the team's success to lose a bench piece before spring training even began last week, it doesn't come entirely without recourse. With that being said, how do the Phillies replace Wilson as the right-handed bench piece? Well, I think it depends on if they're looking for a short-term solution, meaning just the length of the injury, or a long-term solution, meaning for a bulk of the season, and how much of a plug-and-play fit to what Wilson provides are the Phillies looking for. Let's take a look at some of the options for the Phillies bench spot in 2025. Let's start internally where I think the likeliest candidate lies, Buddy Kennedy. Kennedy is out of options this spring, meaning that he either makes the club or has to be passed through waivers. Kennedy is the right-handed bat that they'd be looking for off the bench, but he doesn't provide the same offensive productivity that Wilson would have. He just simply doesn't have the same pop that Wilson provides off the bench. Kennedy had a few clutch moments in 2024, but he did eventually end up hitting just .190 in his at-bats with the Phillies and struck out nearly 27% of the time. He did walk over 15% of his plate appearances, so he can be a selective hitter when he needs to be. The problem with Kennedy is that he doesn't play the outfield. Now, this could be alleviated if the Edmundo Sosa outfield experiment sticks this spring, but to me, you're weakening 2 positions if Sosa moves out of the infield, where he's a rangy defender, and moving him into the outfield so that Kennedy can make the roster. It just feels to me like a slippery slope approach to your bench that's already pretty thin. So why is this the likeliest scenario then? It's the least moving parts. Kennedy is already under contract for cheap and is on the 40-man roster. The Phillies wouldn't have to maneuver anything to make this decision happen. For a team that's just $2 million away from the tax threshold moving their draft pick back 10 spots, this is a fiscally and roster construction-wise easiest move to make. The other options internally would be to say, forget about the right-handed hitting thing for a second and carry Kody Clemens. He's the best hitter of the internal candidates, but again, unless Sosa sticks in the outfield, it feels like Clemens could find himself as an odd man out. And Oscar Mercado is the interesting one, who the Phillies signed to a minor league deal this offseason with an invite to camp. Mercado hasn't played in the majors since 2023, but a good spring could give the Phillies something to think about. So Kennedy doesn't excite you. I get it. It's not super exciting to me either. Let's take a look at some of the outside of the organization players who A, would be willing to sign a minor league deal for cheap, and B, who would have even an outside chance to make the roster. I'll give you a hint, it's not particularly good. Most of the right-handed hitters who would have been intriguing have already signed deals either major league or minor league. Connor Joe, Brian De La Cruz, Manuel Margot, or Mark Canha would have probably been the 4 that intrigued me on either minor league deals or cheap major league deals. But the Phillies did assume that Weston Wilson would be their guy, so there was no need for those players at the time. So who's left? Adam Duvall. Let's start by saying this. Duvall is not and has not been the hitter he was in 2021 in a long time. His K rates have routinely been above 30% over the last few years, and he hasn't had a year in which he's barreled balls above 13% since that 2021 season where he was above 16%. His whiff and chase rates have always been high, and they're going in the wrong direction as he gets older. But if there's one thing that I think Duvall can still do, even if he wasn't successful in it in 2024, is hit the fastball. In 2023, Duvall posted a 4-run value on 4-seam fastballs, hitting .269 and 16 home runs off fastballs entirely. That didn't materialize in 2024 as his numbers across the board did fall, but I do still think he can run into one from time to time. I wouldn't utilize him in the field in much capacity at this point, as his metrics have slipped each of the last 3 years from a time he once was an excellent defender. But this is what you get with bargain barrel shopping. Duvall could provide the right-handed hitting pop that you're looking for. He'd be cheap on a minor league deal, and while you would likely lose Kennedy or Clemens, whoever doesn't make the roster, from the 40-man anyway, so it's a pretty clear plug and play. And if he stinks, Wilson returns, and it's just the remainder of what would be a 1-year deal. None of this is exciting, and this is probably the least exciting portion of it, but it's plausibly the second most likely outcome is that the Phillies wait and see which players are not going to make a team's roster, especially the players who signed to minor league deals with invites to camp. There's also a handful of players who could become victim of number crunches and not make their 26-man roster. Listen, in an MLB The Show world, a perfect world, I would figure out a way to get Andy Pages from the Dodgers, who I think probably will start the year with them in AAA. It's never going to happen, but listen, a guy could dream, right? But I've come up with 3 names that may not make their teams out of camp, and we'll go through them quickly. Let's start with the player that I think is the best of the group, but perhaps the most unlikely to be moved. That's Eli White of the Atlanta Braves. With Ronald Acuna not going to be ready for opening day and the final roster spot for the Braves coming down to White or Luke Williams, I expect White to make the Braves team. But if he doesn't, let's take a look at the numbers from a season ago. Neither were sensational at the plate in the big leagues, but White's number in AAA were better than that of Williams as of late. He hit .290 with an .825 OPS in Gwinnett last season. He also hit 8 home runs, and although he hasn't provided a ton of pop in his small sample size at the major league level, I do think he provides this team with something that they could use, the ability to swipe a bag, and he's very solid defensively in the outfield. Listen, maybe at his core, Eli White is a quad A player, but if White isn't going to make the Braves team out of camp, teams will certainly be interested, and I think the Phillies should be among them. The next is Bobby Dahlbeck. And it's seemingly likely that he's going to make a very bad White Sox team. He was excellent in 2021, hitting 25 home runs and driving in 78, but he's never quite been the same player since. He's gotten just 130 combined at-bats in each of the last 2 years. His strikeout rates and whiff rates have been dreadful throughout his career, even in his good seasons. But he did have a strong 2024 in AAA Worcester, hitting 20 home runs and driving in 68 in 98 games played. Probably another quad A guy who will be on another major league roster to begin the year, but he's someone to keep an eye on if he doesn't make the White Sox team. The final guy I think has the least chance of breaking camp with his club, but he also has the least flexibility. It's Keston Hiura. Hiura was once a heralded prospect and had an excellent rookie year in Milwaukee, but he's gotten further removed from that year each season, and he's only played 10 Major League games since 2022. 3 years is a long time away, especially across Major League Baseball, but in that season, Hiura barreled more than 15% of his batted balls and had a 45% hard hit percentage. He's always whiffed and struck out a ton and has seemingly gotten worse over the years, but if anybody of this group is not going to wind up making their team, it will be Hiura with the Colorado Rockies. Listen, this group is collectively underwhelming, but again, it's kind of what the Phillies are left with at this current juncture. An unforeseen trade could open itself up in the coming weeks, but I'm not sure much more materializes than this. This is kind of what the Phillies are left with at this point. How do they address the final bench piece? That's something that'll remain to be seen. Keep an eye out for who or where the Phillies could acquire a player from in the coming weeks.